if Brooklyn had the largest amount of slaves, where are their cemeteries?
I work with human skeletal remains. So I will examine the skeletons of folks who were enslaved, who died enslaved. And you see the marks of slavery on their bones in the form of, disease, of, traumatic injuries, all sorts of things. And it's a very visceral experience to know that you're looking at someone who looked like you or your family, and this is how they were treated and what happened to them. By default, we're segregated. And so we're also segregated in death. Cemeteries and burial grounds are traditionally segregated. And a lot of this is going to come out of, beliefs that Black people are inferior because, again, we were prevented from, owning particular spaces or were erased from the landscape. Black communities are often subject to urban renewal. Our bodies are far too often disturbed. Many of us in archaeology are pushing for an AGPRA, or an African American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, to try to stop the destruction of our burial grounds too. Just like the ones that we're rediscovering here in Brooklyn. New York, colonized by the Dutch, and the Dutch come over and they pretty much immediately have enslaved people with them. The Dutch had established their own burying ground, but we know that they had, Black folks who also had to be buried, and so nearby but separate from, they also have a Black burying ground.
One of the cemeteries was the equivalent of a block away from the Dutch Reform all-white cemetery, and it had been desecrated. It had been long disturbed.
Funerals were one of the few spaces that Black people had, this agency and this freedom to express themselves. And that's also where you see these very distinct facets of African and African American culture. With very early Black burials, you're not going to find grave markers in the way we think of gravestones now. It was more like they were using perishable things. There might be shells, there might be wood, there might be, things that weren't as durable as what we think of as gravestones. These burials go arguably unmarked, and then they are forgotten and they are erased from the landscape. And then they are suddenly rediscovered when a developer wants to build something. And so there's a proposal to redevelop this site into a community space and affordable housing. And so as part of this, there had to be an investigation into the site to determine if there were still human remains.
So there's a chance that there still remains there.
There was, a human jawbone found there not too long ago, and some teeth. So most likely, yes, there are still burials at this site. And so it was turned over to the community for comment, what they felt should happen. And the resounding response was, nothing should happen on this site. It shouldn't be developed. We shouldn't build anything there. And as far as I know, based on the most recent reports I could find out, they are not going to develop the site. So it appears, at least for now, that this cemetery, or what's left of it, has been successfully protected for the time being. What will happen to it in the future, I am unsure, but hopefully some sort of commemoration of the site and an acknowledgement of the folks who are still buried there. There's also an African burial ground in New Lots, near the New Lots branch of the Brooklyn Public Library. This site, just like other sites, is the segregated burying ground where we had Black folks and the enslaved putting their loved ones to rest. And eventually it is forgotten, or arguably forgotten. And then it's rediscovered on a map not too long ago, actually. So this area had already been converted into, there was a school near the site, and then there's also a playground, Schenck Playground, which is one of the original Dutch settlers in the area who also happened to be slave owners. So this site, ironically named for the slaveholding family, is on top of a burial ground where there are likely the remains of enslaved peoples. So the site is now being redeveloped. It's going to be renamed Sankofa Park. Sankofa meaning looking to the past to move forward, and this comes from Ghana. And they're developing this park into a green space in the neighborhood. They're very conscientious of the fact that there are bodies below, so they will not be disturbing them while they develop this space. And there's a beautiful design that's taken into account this history and memorializing the site and the people buried underneath it. But also significantly, the neighborhood it's in being, a very historically Black neighborhood, this will make it a space where, Black folks and children especially can come and learn about their ancestors who are laid to rest right beneath them, and the folks who kind of paved the way for Black people here in Brooklyn. By using archaeology and archival studies and all these various ways of understanding the past, we can then put our experiences back onto the landscape.